So let's contrast the adventitia with the serosal layer, which is the outermost connective tissue covering of the GI tube. The adventitia is a dense, irregular connective tissue layer found where an organ is held in a fixed position. So, if the organ is retroperitoneal, the adventitia adheres it to the body wall. If the adventitia is between two organs, it adheres those organs to one another. So in that case, it may contain adipose connective tissue, which acts as a shock absorber and filler, rather than primarily dense, irregular connective tissue. Here's an example of adventitia. You can see in this image, on the right side is the trachea, which we looked at when we studied the respiratory system, and on the left side is a portion of the GI tract, the esophagus. Between those two is some connective tissue where we looked at vasculature previously, and that would be considered adventitial tissue. So at higher magnification, you can see it does have some dense connective tissue areas, but primarily it's adipose with vasculature. So an organ may have both serosal and adventitial coverings. So portions of the esophagus and colon and gallbladder all have this kind of arrangement, where the serosa covers the free surface and the adventitia covers the surface where it's either attached to another organ or attached to the body wall. The enteric nervous system is a self-contained nervous system within the gut, and it's comprised of numerous repeating ganglia. So what is a ganglia? A ganglia is neuronal cell bodies outside the CNS, the central nervous system. The CNS is the brain and spinal cord. So as I described previously, this enteric nervous system has two major plexus, the submucosal and the myenteric. The submucosal has motor components which control the mucosa and submucosal gland secretions as well as blood flow to these areas, and sensory components which consist of mechanosensitive neurons within the mucosa that convey information about what's happening in those regions, like the luminal contents and the mucosa and the secretion of glandular status and so on, back to the CNS. In the muscularis externa, which, as you remember from just a few slides back, is between the layers of the smooth muscle in the muscularis, there's a motor component which controls GI motility, peristalsis in other words, and a sensory component which consists of tension-sensitive neurons and chemosensitive neurons that relay information about what's happening in those layers. Now let's talk about all of the different regions of the GI tract one at a time. We'll begin with the esophagus and work our way down the tract all the way to the rectal anal junction. So this diagram was done by a former colleague of mine, and it really pretty nicely summarizes some of the regional differences between all of the regions that we're going to look at in the GI tract. Let's start with the esophagus, which is a fixed tube, which its major purpose is to convey food and fluids from your mouth via the pharynx and down into the stomach. What are its distinguishing features? It's lined by stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium, which is a very thick protective layer that provides protection from the abrasion of the bolus of food that passes down through the tube. It has a very thick muscularis mucosa, which aids in swallowing. The upper third of the muscularis externa is skeletal muscle because swallowing is a voluntary process. The skeletal muscle gradually transitions to all smooth muscle in more distal portions of the esophagus. The esophagus also may contain some mucus-secreting glands in the submucosa, which help to move the bolus of food freely throughout the tube. Here is an image of the wall of the esophagus. You can see on the right side here is the stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelia, and then there is the submucosal layer under that, and the very thick muscularis externa here, and a serosa on the outside. Here's a higher mag, which shows you that non-keratinized epithelial layer. Underneath it, you can see at higher mag the muscularis mucosa, and a little bit of the submucosa down here. And here is the skeletal muscle. That means you must be in the upper third of the esophagus if you're seeing skeletal muscle in the muscularis externa. Where the stomach meets the esophagus, there's a very specialized region called the esophageal cardiac junction. This region has a couple of very characteristic features. You have, first of all, a very abrupt change from the stratified squamous epithelium that lines the esophagus to simple columnar epithelium that lines the stomach and indeed the majority of the gastrointestinal tract. There are also two sets of glands here. The first being a mucosal gland. That means it's directly connected to the mucosal layer, and those are gastric glands of the cardiac region, therefore called cardiac gastric glands. Underlying that, there's specialized glands in the submucosa, which we're going to call esophageal glands. These underlie both the distal region of the esophagus and the cardiac region of the stomach, or cardiac gastric region. They secrete mucus with a neutral pH in order to protect the esophagus and that initial region from the acidity of the stomach in case of a little bit of acid reflux. The muscularis externa layer becomes very thick in this region as well, which forms the inferior esophageal sphincter. So here's an image of the esophageal cardiac junction. In this region, right up here, you can see that transition from this stratified squamous epithelia to a very thin epithelial covering, which is the simple columnar. So that's the epithelial transition. Underlying both of those regions there, you see those submucosal esophageal glands, and directly underneath the mucosa and coming off of the mucosa, you can see cardiac gastric glands. Down here is a bit of that thickened smooth muscle of the sphincter. So here's a higher mag showing you that epithelial transition and a little bit of the esophageal glands shown by the star. The stomach is an expanded or sac-like portion of the GI tract. It functions to mix and begin the digestive process. The food, fluid, and secretions in the stomach wall together comprise a mixture called chyme. Now, histologically, there are three distinct regions, although anatomically you can think of the stomach as having four regions: the cardiac, the fundus, the body, and the pylorus. Really, the fundus and the body histologically are identical, so we're just going to call them the body. The stomach wall has the four expected layers, just as the rest of the GI tract does. But what are its distinguishing features? So the epithelium is comprised of surface mucus cells and gastric glands, which are embedded in that lamina propria layer of the mucosa. There are longitudinal submucosal folds called rugae that are present in the stomach and allow for expansion when the stomach is filled with food. And unlike other portions, the muscularis externa does not have two layers, it has three layers. Now, These are typically called the inner oblique, middle circular, and outer longitudinal, but oftentimes they can be difficult to distinguish as, being in a particular orientation other than the outer longitudinal. So their orientation may appear a little bit random. The outermost layer of the wall is always serosa for the stomach. There's no adventitia here. So what are the features of the individual regions that I mentioned? So in the cardiac region, just as when we looked at the esophageal cardiac junction, it's located at and adjacent to that junction. You have shallow, mucus-producing gastric glands that open out of those gastric pits. So here you can see the arrows that are showing you the actual secretory portions of the glands embedded in the lamina propria. At the bottom, the MM stands for muscularis mucosa. And at the top, where you see GP, that's gastric pit, that is located in the lumen and showing you those deep invaginations there, which are gastric pits opening into the gastric glands. So in the very proximal portion, you can sometimes see portions of the esophageal glands, just as we did in the esophageal cardiac region. Now, as you move into the fundus and body regions of the stomach, the gastric glands change. The gastric pits become quite deep, and they have 2 to 4 deep gastric glands originating from each of the gastric pits. The surface mucus cells line the surface of the stomach as well as the gastric pits. And there's a very thick mucosal layer because the pits and the fundic glands are quite extensive. They also have a very diverse cell population, which we're going to look at. So here you can see a low magnification of the fundus or body region of the stomach. So at the top, here we are, this is the surface of the stomach. Out here would be the lumen. So these would be surface mucus cells here, which line the surface and the gastric pits. Here's a gastric pit, and that extends sometimes down to here if you're in the right plane of section. And then from about this region down, you can see gastric glands all the way down to here. So the mucosa is from all the way up here at the surface mucus cell, all the way down to where you have a muscularis mucosa down here. And then this would be submucosa underneath. Diagrammatically, on the left here you can see the layers of the wall itself. So the mucosa, which includes the gastric surface and pits, the gastric glands, lamina propria, and muscularis mucosa. Then the next layer being the submucosa, then the 3 different layers of smooth muscle in different orientations of the muscularis externa, and on the outside the serosal covering. On the right, the diagram demonstrates the finer structural characteristics of the gastric pits and the gastric glands. So you can see that the gastric pits are lined by the mucus surface cells, and then the gastric glands have a couple of different cell types, which we're going to discuss in more detail. The most important of these being the parietal cells and the chief cells.